welcome to the Powerful Entrepreneur Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of the Powerful Entrepreneur series. I'm Arthur Scholsky, your host, and we have a very special guest here with us today talking about Pointe du Hoc, the famous battle in World War II. With us we have Brandon McCarty, who is the CEO and co-founder of Curement Inc., a software startup disrupting the supply chain for the dental industry. Before that, he was the COO and co-founder of CGC, an innovative consulting firm that provides fundraising and marketing services to nonprofits. He is also an adjunct professor for Pepperdine's fully employed MBA course, where he teaches how to fund entrepreneurial ventures. And just 4 short years ago, Brandon served as a member of the 75th Ranger Regiment, where he was deployed 4 times and conducted over 100 special operation missions. We are very pleased to have Brandon with us today. Brandon, go ahead and say hello.
Hi, everybody. Excited to be a powerful entrepreneur, so thanks for having me.
Brandon, you're the main force behind motivation for Powerful Entrepreneur.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. It's a pretty cool concept, man. I'm really happy to be a part of it.
You're the definition. If you open the dictionary of the Powerful Entrepreneur, you see Brandon's face. No, but we're super happy to be here. And really what we're talking about today is, this epic battle, Pointe du Hoc. And really, where was the world at when this battle happened? Well, it was 1944. And, World War II was, I would say it was more of a scale up in the size of the war rather than a scale down. 1944 was really the last big year for Nazi Germany's arm and hand over Europe. So really, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Germany, they were producing more tanks, more guns than they had in any of the years past. The United States entering into the European theater after taking out North Africa and entering into the Italian theater of war. So 1944 was quite a tumultuous time. And I think for all sides, whether it was the Russians, the English, the Germans, or the Americans, the French resistance fighters, it was anyone's game. And there was a lot of unknowns. What was the big play that the U.S. military had in their back pocket after they, concluded the invasion of Sicily and they started taking northern or southern Italy? Was the D-Day invasions, which were an extremely risky endeavor, to say the least. They really did not know whether or not they were even going to go forward with the D-Day invasions because there were so many different variables at play. Normandy wasn't necessarily the most advantageous position to hold in France for an assault on Germany. So it was a big risk in many different ways, but that was the decision from top brass. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, some of the great generals at the time, they had decided that D-Day was the option. Now, in order for D-Day to be successful, there were certain specific missions within the D-Day invasions that were, I would say, more risky than the others. I think almost all the D-Day landings were risky, to say the least, but there were a few that were far riskier than some of the others. And that's really where this conversation starts, is Pointe du Hoc.
Yeah, and I'd like a couple of things. So one of the things I thought was really interesting was that in 1941, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin actually had a meeting in Moscow. Joseph Stalin was adamant about creating a front line on the Western Front. And in 1941, Stalin kept asking for this, and it was actually a point of contention between the two. And Churchill basically said that, they were nowhere ready to do that. And so that's where they decided to go up the African or the Italy in the southern part of the continent. So just to give you an idea that this was something that they wanted to do 3 years ago between Stalin and Churchill. And so in 1944, as the United States were coming in, that they as risky as it was, it took 3 years before they even felt like they could actually accomplish it.
Can't be understated how many questions were around this prior to it happening. They were all looking to Ike to say, are we going to go every day, right, for a couple months? And Ike, at times, was considering ending it. We're not doing it. So this was a risk of risks. If they had never gone through with the D-Day invasions, one of the big things that could have happened, besides, a prolonged Nazi occupation of Germany, was the Russian takeover of all of Germany. And because we entered into D-Day when we did, we were able to set ourselves up for a successful Western occupation of parts of Germany, which led to the Cold War in the 50s and the eventual collapse of communism. So if we had not entered into D-Day when we did, if the decision was prolonged, there was been a good chance that Russia would have taken all of Berlin and most of Germany, because we would not have had that footing in France when we did.
Good point. Yep. And you also think if they would have failed, like, what is the morale? I mean, because it was one of these things that was a buildup where Germany was finally potentially on the way down. And if we would have done D-Day and actually failed to take the beaches that day, can you imagine the morale that would have been lowered in the whole Allied front about what's going on here, and the motivation on the German side? And who knows how much longer this war would have took, and even if it would have been won by our side.
Exactly. And there's so many different variables, and it's one of the most complex times in world history, because of the number of characters and the number of nation states involved. And honestly, like, if we want to get into the main conversation here of really what we're talking about, Pointe du Hoc being one of the most key elements of the Normandy invasions. Let's start diving into this Pointe du Hoc conversation, and there's a lot of really great content to get into. But, if we really want to talk about some of the key characters here, just to touch on them, Colonel Rudder being, in charge and given the order to assault Pointe du Hoc, and, the great Omar Bradley going as far as saying this was the hardest mission he ever had to give to one of his men, was the assault on Pointe du Hoc. And they turned right down the line. They went right to Rudder and the Army Rangers to engage that mission. For Omar Bradley to say that after his take in Sicily, his long history with the American military, that says a lot.
Absolutely. So,
and, let's really get into this Pointe du Hoc battle, now that we've kind of set up the landscape for, why it was so important. Perspective. Let's talk about these tactics. Like, why was Pointe du Hoc such an important piece of land?
Let's do it.
From my research, and this is kind of after studying Erwin Rommel, right, the great German general who set up a lot of the defensive patterns in France during German occupation. Erwin Rommel is quoted as saying that Pointe du Hoc was the key element of that region's defense. And the reason is because of its elevated position. It was on top of large cliff faces with narrow beaches, and the amount of firepower the Germans had instilled upon those cliffs could cover a number of large beach fronts, which were, susceptible to enemy attack. So if the Germans were to hold Pointe du Hoc, like Erwin Rommel had a goal of continuing to hold Pointe du Hoc, it could have led to an absolutely devastating assault by the U.S. forces. The number of ordnance batteries on Pointe du Hoc could hit around 3 beaches on Omaha, which was one of the main fronts for the American D-Day invasions.
Yeah, I mean, the Pointe du Hoc, that cliff was, what divided the two different attacks between Utah and Omaha. So, them being in between there, if the United States never were able to take that cliff, they would have been cut off between each other. And because the United States was able to get the cliff, they were able to have their supply chains and communications between each other more efficient. So definitely a big deal. And one of the things I found most interesting was, getting too much into it, but it was such an important thing. And so the Germans were there, but the Germans never really thought that anyone would try to invade the way that the Americans did there. So they actually were weakened in their approach to defending the cliffs because it was such a crazy way of doing it, climbing ladders and the whole thing, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I thought that was funny, was like the thing that you would think they would never do, the most dangerous, actually turned into being the most successful way to approach it.
I think Erwin Rommel tried, but I think the U.S. had a lot of aggressiveness behind their march. They wanted to get the job done. I think that's really what this is about, is they had a lot of momentum to get this job done. These Rangers went through very specialized training, practicing on the cliffs in England, going so far as borrowing ladders from local fire divisions in England to practice their training because they knew the task ahead of themselves. Heading out over to France, a lot of the men I'd say they were in the know with the severity of the mission, but a lot of the men didn't necessarily know how desperate the mission was and what the generals were asking the Rangers to do. And I think there was a great story about Colonel Cleveland A. Little. When he was on the ship being taken over to France with his men, they did a debrief, and he was appalled that the general staff was still willing to go move forward with the Pointe-du-Hoc assaults. And so much so that he was relinquished of command. And this was a gentleman who later in the war won multiple medals, was very distinguished, was a very brave individual. And for him to individually go so far as to become removed directly prior to the mission being undertaken just goes to show how the severity of the task that was being given.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I don't know, just giving a context of like why was this dangerous, right? Like what makes this, we've kind of talked about doing it, why people, didn't think it would happen, but what specifically, why do we feel that way? You want to touch upon that?
So why this was so dangerous was because it was really a tactical position, right? Why this was so dangerous. And if you know anything about like amphibious landing craft and German defensive power, why were the Germans so strong defensively? Because of their firing lines, because of their machine gun positions, the amount of firepower that a German defensive force could put down on a broad beach, let alone a very narrow beach, which is what these Rangers were about to deal with. These amphibious assault crafts would land on this very narrow beach, put 70, a couple hundred men on one of these beaches, and they would have to scale a pretty massive cliff face in front of them with grappling hooks, ladders, ad hoc methods, all under immense firepower. That was quite a task to ask of someone. I don't think that anyone expected many of them to come back. And that was actually made clear to these brave men right from the start.
And I'd say like most people I'm sure have seen, Saving Private Ryan. So obviously that concept of D-Day and like storming the beaches and bullets and the chaos that goes on there. One of the things I think is really crazy about the whole thing is just imagine seeing all of that, but then there's a cliff in front of you that's 100 feet tall. And your job is to throw a grappling hook on top of this cliff where there's cannons going off and the chaos that occurs, and you're climbing this little wire ladder with all the gear and equipment, people in front of you falling off the cliff, and you continue to climb up of it. Then once you get up, you just see nothing but Germans. Like as a former military and a ranger, like I can only imagine. Like at some point, I always try to put myself like, what would I be thinking about? And so some of the things that I did or our missions, I think it just gets to a point where you just don't even care anymore. Where you're like, this is my job. You don't even really know, like, you just know that you're supposed to accomplish the job. You don't even know the context of it. Because if you think about it too much, it's just insane and you won't do it. So you're just like, my job is to climb this ladder and then I'll deal with whatever's up there. So to me, there's D-Day and then there's Point to Hawk where I just can only imagine having all these things going on. You can't imagine just being helpless on a ladder. Like, you can't shoot, you can't do anything. You're just stuck on a ladder. I think that, to me, that's the craziest part.
Powerful words, man. Powerful words. And it kind of reminds me of almost like a medieval siege, right? But it's not melee. These guys have guns.
Yeah, medieval siege with, instead of arrows, you have machine guns being shot at you.
Oh, and no body armor back then. No protection.
Yeah, yep.
None. And communications were fickle at best. Let's jump into that. Let's jump into these. There was 3 assaults, really. There was the first assault was early in the morning. It was 70 men under Captain Ralphie Goranson, and they hit first wave. Their job was to scale one of the flanking cliffs under the cover of darkness with the hope that they could kind of get a little bit of a surprise going. And this was actually before some of the main attacks on the Omaha, Utah beaches that were going to be undergone. So they really wanted to kind of distract the Germans to that side of the point before the main attack. They came under heavy fire, and by the time that they were able to make it up the cliff face, only 12 men out of 70 remained. So that was just kind of a sign of what was to come in that battle. And then the main force hit under Colonel Rudder, Lieutenant Colonel Rudder. And he had 3 Ranger companies under his command. And one of the things that they had to deal with first was poor weather conditions and poor communication. They were expecting to be receiving communication from the beachhead. They were not able to. They thought they were going to be landing somewhere else, and they ended up being moved off track by 40 minutes. And so by the time they actually hit the beach where they were supposed to, they were 40 minutes behind schedule. And the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force was hitting Point to Hoke all evening to lighten the defenses, and they had stopped firepower about 40 minutes prior to when the main force under Colonel Rudder hit the beaches, which means that the Germans had enough time to prepare a defensive line to meet the main Ranger assault.
And I'd say one of the things I find interesting, and the basic way that an assault happens, without getting too into the weeds of how it works, but usually what you have is your line of support. So you'll have your machine gun where you're creating a volume of fire and then you have your maneuver element. So one of the things I find really interesting, like I talked about, is climbing these ladders. I can imagine that, these guys weren't able to actually bring on their heavy guns up these ladders. So, they probably just had their basic rifles, the M1s, and I think there was another, I forgot the name of it, the type of rifle that they used. But, a normal element, you'll go up, you'll lay down a line of fire, machine guns going on, and it kind of keeps the heads down of the enemy. And then you have your maneuver element that comes and flanks on the side. But these guys came up there, and they didn't have any of the machine guns with them because they're obviously very light to climb these ladders. So to me, it's pretty impressive that they were able to accomplish all of that and the maneuver and everything that they've been trained without any sort of heavy guns on their side for the maneuver element.
Brutal. I couldn't even imagine. I don't think anyone could, how lopsided the chances of this succeeding were. And, eventually Rudder did make it up the cliffs. Conditions were muddy. The grappling hooks were slipping. Germans were right there on them. Eventually they did make it up the cliffs. And I think they had experienced a 70% casualty rate on the main force by the time they were able to maintain a position on the top of the cliffs. And then that's not the end of it. They had to wait around on the top of the cliffs and defend against constant German counterattacks for almost 2 days. They were running out of ammunition. They were running low on food. The Germans had moved the guns prior to the invasion. So all of the aerial reconnaissance, all the information that Colonel Rudder had when he got up there was wrong. So they had to send out these teams of a couple guys to hunt down where were the guns. Not only were they, dealing with German counterattacks when they got up on those cliffs, but they didn't have the correct information. That all being said, the Rangers defended their position. They found and destroyed the guns, and they were able to wait until the 116th Infantry broke through the beaches and relieved their position.
And Arthur, I think there's one point that you just touched over that I think is, when I talk to people about business, and one of the things that I found as a challenge on my career is when I go and we talk about starting a company and, leading a startup to profitability and all the challenges that go with it, often some of them go, well, if you're in the military, there's a different sense of them. That's why they're qualified for that. They can handle adversity. And so one of the things you touched upon that I just want people to really think about is, so imagine the fear that you have when you're told that your job is to go up these cliffs and take over this area. And so, you see 70% of your brothers are dead, are dying. You finally get to the top of this hill and you've accomplished what you're doing. And you look and they say, well, the guns aren't here. To me, the difference between obviously as a Ranger myself, like I say Rangers, but like the average person and, military people or people that have that inside of them is the average person gets to the top and they say, I did what I was supposed to do. My job was to get cliff. My job was to take over and do all this stuff. And now it becomes self-preservation. I need to survive. And you got to think about it as these guys did that. Then they said to themselves, well, we were supposed to get these guns. Screw self-preservation. My job's not over until I go find them. And so they go into the meat of the enemy to find these guns. And so I think that's just a perspective of, going above and beyond, what is asked of you to understand the bigger cause for what you're trying to do. And I think that's a really cool thing to really think about is, you get there, you feel like you've accomplished it, and then you realize there's a little bit more you can do.
I mean, let's face it, how many people are content with bare minimum? They see themselves as, I did it. I did what was asked of me. I got through another day at work. You're never going to have a very successful business if that's your mindset. And I know a lot of us, when we talk about these harrowing stories, it's very humbling. It's a very humbling thing to talk about these things. Men's sacrifice. We're able to sit here and have this conversation. And you have this conversation about entrepreneurship. And I oftentimes I hear people say to me, how do you feel about taking these stories of that you yourself can never understand, which I can never understand these stories. I'm blessed. I say it's better to not talk about them than to just be humbled, let them exist in history without having the conversation. And I think a lot of people let that happen. They would rather not talk about the conversation, just be humbled and let history technically be forgotten. And that's what you see a lot of times. I find that the lesser of the two evils is let's have the conversation. Let's put ourselves in these uncomfortable positions, talk about these stories of heroism, be humbled by them, and remember what these men sacrificed for us to have then the conversation about entrepreneurship, to bring creativity to the world, to make the world a little better place in our own way in the 21st century.
And I would add to it is also as an entrepreneur, the motivation to move forward. And again, clearly business and war are two different things. But whenever you think you have a bad day, or you're getting told no, or you can't make payroll, or your company's whatever challenges you're facing, I think it's good if you understand the context of what a person can go through. And just understanding that what you're doing is not that bad and that you can push a little further and you just figure a way. So I think, while they are different, I do believe that, a true, if you're a really good leader and a valuable entrepreneur to society, like you just understand, you learn from everywhere you possibly can. whether it's through war or other business leaders, and you understand like how did they lead and how did they conduct themselves to be successful. I think there's a lot of parallels there.
A ton of parallels. And, really kind of continue this conversation, we talked about getting the job done, right? Going above and beyond, getting the job done. And what does that take? I think that's really the main focus here in this article as a takeaway to everyday entrepreneurs is what does it take to not just get the job done, but to go above and beyond. Ultimately, it takes the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, your time, your energy. At the end of the day, like you must be willing to invest your entire life in a venture in order to see it be successful. You have to be willing to go that distance. There's really no in between. There's no cautious foot when it comes to having a successful entrepreneurial venture. If you want to get the job done and you want to get the job done right, you have to sacrifice. I have a great story about old colleagues of mine. I came on as their contract CFO, and I'm not going to drop any names, but these guys had everything. They had money. We had fundraising. We had top players in the industry that we were pursuing. We had time. We had years of runway. We had some of the smartest people. We had marketing geniuses. We had technology geniuses. Honestly, I would say in my long career of helping entrepreneurs, it was one of those stories that I don't think I could have had a better start to the story than what we did. What had happened was these individuals were unable to let go of their lifestyle from prior to their entrepreneurial ventures. And what I kind of mean by that is most of these guys and most of these women had worked in these very successful fields, making 6 figures, making 7 figures, making a name for themselves, private jets, first class, fine dining, cigars, the whole 9 yards, right? Every single day, being top names in their industries. And they went into their project, this entrepreneurial dream, with all of the right tools, all of the right assets. And one thing that did not stop was their prior lifestyle. I mean, it was, I remember it's this day, we had just won a big partnership with one of the top names in the industry. And honestly, if I said his name, I'm sure a lot of people would recognize it. And we were celebrating. We were out. We were partying it up in Los Angeles. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, what have we won yet? Have we won anything? Did we accomplish our goal? Did we get the job done yet? Why does it seem like mission accomplished when it's not? I became very skeptical. And about 6 months later, we were so in the hole. We had blown through our runway. We had brought on so many big names, so many high egos that the sacrifice needed to get this company up and running was completely missing. None of these people with big egos were willing to sacrifice anything of their own personal comfort to see this company to fruition. Very quickly, that company went under. Bad news bears at that point. All these egos came to play. The lawyers were involved. There was a lot of finger pointing. And this once very promising, well set up entrepreneurial venture just came crumbling down. Ultimately, it was because of one reason. No one was willing to sacrifice a thing.
I think there's a lot of things. One of the things I first touch upon, though, is sacrifice, and we talking about this point to hawk mission. And so, as a CEO of Curement, one of the things that I really took away from the military, why did these people, these Rangers, decide to do this, right? We were talking about how dangerous it was and death and all this stuff, but think about, why? Why did they decide to do that, And I think it always goes to the overall vision of why they're involved in this unit. And I think from any entity, you talk about sacrifice, what makes an employee, what makes a leader, a co-founder or whatever you want to talk about, what makes them willing to sacrifice? And I think that's one of the things you have to start with, because the word sacrifice is thrown around and you kind of understand what it means. But I think the fundamental aspect is, why would somebody sacrifice? And so you think in the context of, Point to Hawk in World War II, is that the vision of what the United States stood for in freedom and democracy, it was so strong that people would have given their life for it. And then you have to go into more detail about, the chain of command and the person next to you. But all of these things have to be in place to sacrifice. And so, like, as a business leader, I think those are one of the things you have to realize, is making sure that, people don't just sacrifice, and you're going to ask, especially as a startup, you need to sacrifice because you lead by example. But your first employees that are going to come in there, they're going to need to sacrifice. And you have to put a glue together about what's the point in all of this. And there has to be an end to it. Like, if you told everyone in the United States that you're going to be running up cliffs for the rest of your life, and no one's going to do that, but you say that there's an end to this. We do this one mission and freedom, and you'll be living free, and you'll be in your, back home in Kansas and all that type of stuff. So I think that's the first point I'd like to definitely touch upon as a leader, entrepreneurial ventures, is figuring out, why are you doing this and what's the end point for you? And then the sacrifices become inept. Not even a question. It doesn't even feel like a sacrifice. It's just more of your job.
I love it. Understanding that premise, what's the motivation? That's step one, just like you said, Brandon. If it's an entrepreneurial venture, is it the overall mission of your organization? Is it your mission statement? Is that something you're willing to sacrifice for? I think a lot of people look at their mission statement of their organization as more of an obligation that they have to put in a PowerPoint presentation. You're asking employees to jump on. You're asking for other partnerships, people to invest their time, invest their resources, maybe at low pay. People are already starting to sacrifice early for your organization. That mission statement has to be worth it.
Yeah, and then you have to think about the second part of this. So you have this vision and this whole thing that you're doing, and now you have to equip it with the right talent. So, you got to think about, you're talking about these people that go to the cliffs, but there's a huge selection process on who's a ranger and who's a person back running paperwork, right? And so you have to find a way to not only have this vision and mission in place of why we're doing this, but find the people who truly believe it and have shown and have motivation internal. And you have to vet those people. You have to train them, put them in the right position. So there's a lot of parallels to business. And so it's about putting the right talent in there. Give you an idea, like, obviously I never participated, and I know there's tons of stuff we can go into the World War II, but I give you a context of how selection worked for our Ranger Regiment when I went through in 2010. So it was an 8-week process, but there's particularly one section that's a 3-day camp. And so when we first started the program, it's called RASP, Ranger Assessment Selection Program. So when we first got there was about 170 people who decided that they wanted to be a part of the unit. And so the first 2 weeks, they're doing a lot of running and all this type of stuff, and people are renowned. I remember in the first day, we lost about 20 people. Don't even know where they went. They were just gone. And so we get to this, they call it Coal Range. So anybody that's ever been in Ranger Regiment, they know what Coal Range is. And it's a 3-day process where the whole aspect of this is to dwindle down the team. So when we got there, I was thinking, we're at 170 when we started. We're now at 150. And, we're about a week into this. And I'm saying to myself, the attrition rate's supposed to be really high. I'm like, this isn't very hard at all. This is pretty easy. And I was kind of disappointed. So when you go into Coal Range, they started off by about 6 in the morning, or actually now 2 in the morning. They throw in smoke grenades and all kinds of stuff into your barracks. Your job is to grab your rucksack, and then you do a 12-mile hike into the woods. And then from there, it's basically a 3 days of just torture-ish things that you do. And by the time we got out of Coal Range, this 3-day event, we went from 150 people, and we had about 50.
Wow.
And that's in 3 days. And I just remember seeing all of that. And what made me excited about it was, I knew that these were the guys that I would go for. And so it excited me. And so I can think about, World War II and the things that they had to go through to be a part of that unit and to accomplish it. And so you draw from that and you think about your company. How do you figure out who are the people that you want involved? And if you get the right people, you can do anything. So the sacrifice, yes, it needs to happen, but people don't sacrifice for no reason. There has to be a point to it.
Awesome. I mean, that was a great example, Brandon. It made my example look like nothing. I think you hit the nail on the head in regards to the team you got to put around yourself, the fact that how important is your mission statement, how important is the goals of the organization, the goals of the team, what drives people to being willing to sacrifice. How important is it to put these quality individuals that aren't just technically gifted, aren't just gifted in sales, aren't just gifted in management or coding or building prototypes, but people who are underlining the organization with their motivations, with their willingness to give it all, get the job done, go above and beyond. And there's a lot of parallels that we can have between this story, the Rangers, Colonel Rudder, their mission, and what it takes to run and start and be successful with a entrepreneurial adventure. So it's a great story. I'm glad we're having the conversation. I'm really happy, Brandon, that you were able to join us on this conversation, this journey. We did a lot of research, a lot of reading up and understanding what these men had gone through, and really just kind of understanding how can this be a form of leadership training for people today. Remember these stories. You know, how important is it to remember these stories? Brandon, you really hit on a lot of those different key points that a leader in our today's day and age should be able to take home with them.
Yeah, and you know, to touch one other quick story that I think to me what's very exciting, I'm proud to be part of the Ranger Brotherhood, was that, you know, we talked about all the selections. And I remember one day going in there, they took all our chairs away, and for about 8 hours, the only thing we could do was be on a knee. And we were in this room, and there was a table in front of us. And for 8 hours, on one knee, we learned about Ranger history. It was so painful, if you can imagine being on a tile floor on one knee for 8 hours. But they just taught us Ranger history, and they beat into our head what had come before us. Again, setting that culture and that idea of like what you're going through versus what other people did. And one of the main stories was Point to Hawk and what they went through. And so this story to me is something that, you know, as I went through selection, my reasons for joining Ranger Regiment had to do a little bit more with, like, you know, Pat Tillman and those types of things. But one of the things the Rangers beat into your head is the history of this unit. And so Point to Hawk is, when I learned about that, to me, it's one of the most impressive things. And I'm proud to just even be able to say that I was a part of a unit like that. You know, I'm just glad we were able to bring this to light, this particular mission that happened during D-Day.
Yeah, you know, and that's really what this mission's about, right? Is bringing history to the people that wouldn't necessarily read about these stories. Let's face it, how most people I think we talk to in business have remembered history as their sixth grade dates and names and what was the name of this battle, and that's about it. But at the end of the day, you know, we're all eventually going to be just history, aren't we? You know, and there's a lot of human content, human context that can be taken away from this. And Brandon, we're just absolutely humbled and honored and blessed to have you as part of this conversation, a part of the family, as an example to all of us. You know, what is sacrifice? What does it take to get the job done? What does it take to be a leader? What does it take to put good people around you? All those great lessons that this story embodies. So just thank you, man, for being a part of this. We really look forward to the next one. I hope you're on board.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing better than talking in history. I mean, sounds like a great degree to me. I don't know if they offer it, but I'd be all about it.
I think they do. Anybody can study history, though. Just pick up that nearest book. One you think that stands out to you. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it exists. Very good, Brandon. Any closing words, man? Before we let everyone get back to their day jobs?
No, I'd say just thanks for listening, and just think about, you know, what you can do in your own business and what you can draw from in history. I mean, I think there's so much education, and why fail or why struggle when probably thousands of people before you have witnessed the same challenges? Learn from their mistakes instead of making them yourself.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Brandon. This is Brandon McCarty, everybody, CEO and co-founder of Curement. Go check that out. It's a great organization. They're doing some really cool things. Signing off, Arthur Scholsky, powerful entrepreneur. Take care.